I went in for my, I had cancer last year, and I have to go in every 3 months for my scans. So I went in for my scans. Everything looks good.
That's
So far,
great.
That's
so
great,
good.
Ben.
But my oncologist, like, I thought to ask her today, I was like, hey, so if I hadn't come in for treatment, would I be dead yet? And she was like, yeah.
Wow.
And I was like, so I'm running on your time now, huh? And she was like, I guess so. I was like, thanks. I appreciate it. I like life. It's pretty good.
That's a good question to ask.
Well, at some point you're just like, man, like I got life back. Like I'd be dead. Feels good. Feels
I
good.
can imagine. Yeah, everything. Well, this conversation feels pretty small and trivial related.
It doesn't because,
Don't fool yourself, Evan.
of the things that we live for, like the things that make life good, just heart beating and eyes open is not really doing a whole lot for you.
That's true.
It's everybody in all the communities and the things that make life great. That's worth we're kicking it.
Yeah, someone famous who I can't remember said, science is how we live and art is why we live.
That's great.
That is great. Yeah, that's it. And I appreciate your book. I live in Nashville where Parnassus is. So I've been there several times. We got the bookshop in our neighborhood. That's the one that I tend to go to because it's in East Nashville.
Yeah.
But Parnassus is something, it was an enigma already when I moved here. And I didn't realize it had only been open for 2 years. And but you're right. The way that you describe it, you're like, it's like a store in the middle. It doesn't even look like Nashville. And yet you walk in there and it kind of transforms. The beauty in it is that you walk from this kind of what looks like a bit run down, even though it's right across the street from like the hoitiest mall in town. Like I've always said that part of Nashville, it's like all the worst parts of LA with none of the upside. The traffic, the self-congratulations, the fancy cars, but no beach, no great museums, green hills.
Yeah, I was kind of worried about writing that introduction because I wanted in all the chapters to give a good sense of atmosphere and what these spaces were like. And I had seen pictures of Parnassus and of course knew the history behind it and Ann Patchett's story, which sounded quite heroic and was definitely striking a triumphant tone. But then I drove there and was like, this is where the charming bookstore is. And, I studied urban history in grad school. And this was like, I think I write in the book, it was a placeless place. And this had all the markers of just bad or lack of planning and is kind of sprawl in all the worst ways. And it was quite a relief to actually open that door and step across the threshold into what felt like a sanctuary and on the outside was very much hellish in a variety of ways.
So, Evan, I studied a little bit of urban history in grad school. And so I'm reading your book and I'm thinking, this is an urban history. Like there's so much about this book that it is a history of place, right? In many ways, because a bookstore is a place that people congregate not just to buy books. And in fact, you say this many times, many people who walk in and out of the bookstores every day, and some who come every day never buy a book, but yet it is often the heartbeat of whatever neighborhood it's in. So maybe start off by telling us what led you to write this book. What was the bookstore that set you on this path?
Yeah, so I was studying urban history, living in New York City, and my wife lucked into a job at a small independent bookstore called Three Lives and Company, and on a kind of square foot basis might be the most formidable bookstore in the world. It's just an amazing but tiny but very powerful space that's really an anchor of a community. And as you just mentioned, what fascinated me about bookstores were really the sense that they were part of the fabric of a place, of a neighborhood, of a city. And as somebody who was born in 1980 and had lived through already the decline of many bookstores and was yearning for the kinds of places that made life feel interesting and artistic. And you mentioned before we got on this, record shops and coffee shops. These are just vibrant kind of spaces that are fun to inhabit and be in. So I had been a serious reader, but hadn't meditated much on why bookstores really mattered until my then girlfriend, now wife, got a job, and I started to just hang out in the bookstore. And what I realized was that so many people just hung out in the bookstore, or that a lot of people just popped in for 10, 15 minutes almost as a kind of therapy. And that there was something for not everybody, but a significant part of the population for the bookstores were an essential part of their lives and was an essential part of what made, in this case, the village feel like a village.
Yeah, I should say to make sure we don't overlook this, Evan Friss, your book came to us from by means of Dane Honeycutt, our good friend, who himself, I don't know, it's a chicken or the egg question about whether or not Dane's love of bookstores led him to your book, or whether your book led him to his love of bookstores. Dane now, I think, reads more than Bob or I might even read.
It's true. And Ben, I was telling Evan that, many listeners know that I'm in a band, and it's a touring band. Dane Honeycutt is our tour manager. Dane Honeycutt carries around a tub of books, and it's like he has his own traveling lending library, and he's always giving people books. And like I always say, Ben, like you and I, we always have a stack, and it's so hard we have books that we have to read because we do this. And so he's trying to give me a book that he says I have to read. But, so anyway, just to add to Dane's mystique.
Yeah. And for those of you guys, when Dane's not touring, and even when he is, he's one of my best friends in the world. And I will say that Dane has done the same thing with me, recommended many books. But the one he's always come back to is, Evan, your book, The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore. I catch myself here, and this might be a good springboard into it, because I've got in my head like the difference between the bookshop and the bookstore, right? And you make there's like a difference between this, especially in early American history. Let's get into this. Let's start back at the beginning. Why does the difference between a bookshop and a bookstore matter at certain periods in history?
Well, first I'll say that I think booksellers are happy for anybody to come into their shop or store. And I only say this because there was a review in the New Yorker which harped on this comment, or this preference that some booksellers have for bookshop over bookstore as a kind of marker of elitism or snobbery, which is not at all how I meant it or what I understand when booksellers prefer bookshop to bookstore. And it's really just difference of emphasis. And that is that the bookshop suggests a place where commercialism isn't really the only purpose. And one of the central arguments of the book is that bookstores are stores and they're selling a retail product like all other stores. And yet that's where the similarities end, that it's a really unique animal. And part of it is that they're meant to be places where people gather, congregate. And I don't know a single bookseller who went into it because they were interested in selling product.
Yeah.
You Ben, you got a follow-up?
Go ahead, Bob. Go ahead.
This is going to be a tough conversation because there's just so much.
I know.
So
just so you guys know, he goes from like colonial America into like the year it's published, like 2 years ago. So we and the stories are fascinating. So go ahead and order it while you're listening right now. Just go ahead and get the book so that you don't get mad at us for leaving stuff out.
The concept of bookstore is old in terms of American history, but still relatively new in terms of human history. And I start the book with Ben Franklin, and I write about the origins of the word bookstore, which emerged in the colonial period. But when people were first starting to sell books, they didn't know what to call them, in large part because they were selling a small number of books and a bunch of other stuff, or they were just a kind of guy traveling around, sort of like your manager, except selling them instead of giving them, but was doing other kinds of things and had some books on them. So there weren't really bookstores as we know them until close to the American Revolution. And even then, they weren't exactly the kind of cozy spaces we would imagine. That wouldn't happen for many decades to come.
Well, Franklin's interesting as you described, because he's almost like a template for or a forebearer of many of the booksellers who come after him, because there is this uh, he's a seller and a publisher, and he's a displayer, a purveyor of ideas. So how does Franklin go from being a printer to a bookseller? And talk about that period of the revolution and how important the written word was and the distribution of it was at that time.
Yeah, so it was really hard to get books in the colonies. There weren't many people printing them, and almost all the stuff everyone wanted to read was European in origin. So there weren't great American authors or even British American authors as we would think of them. And Franklin found his way to bookselling, some ways by accident, but as you sort of suggest, it was a kind of manifestation of him being seriously invested in printing, which was the trade that he just learned as a kid, a serious and voracious reader, and also a writer. So even when he was very young, was writing essays, trying to get them published. He had all these ideas that, of course, coalesce into some of the Enlightenment ones that spur the American Revolution. And fundamentally, the revolution is about convincing these British people that they don't want to be British anymore and that they're actually American. And that's as much an intellectual revolution as anything else. So how do you convince people? And, most famously, there are works like Thomas Paine's Common Sense, but it only affects people if they hear it or read it themselves. So Franklin was one of a number of colonial booksellers who begin to not just write stuff, but are distributing information, serving as middlemen between European Enlightenment philosophy and colonists who were gobbling this stuff up. But books were very expensive. Not everyone was literate. And so Franklin and other booksellers often had to sell practical goods that people needed alongside the books, which weren't even like books as we would imagine them. They were much more pamphlet-like, not very colorful, often extended essays. And again, a lot of people reading religious work or what we would think of as nonfiction kind of essays. They weren't reading novels for the most part.
One of the things that I think is fascinating about the American Revolution is this Puritan legacy, this Protestant legacy in New England that leads to these higher literacy rates in the region. And it's fascinating to go back to the idea that the Puritans, who were not particularly tolerant, set in place a society in which literacy rates were high enough to where whenever the printed word comes out, a lot more people than most parts of the world can read.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent and astute observation about thinking about what people value, what kind of practices you want to instill, and the power of reading. This is the same phenomenon that Southern slave owners figured out when they insisted and in many states created laws that prohibited enslaved people from becoming literate. Because they had maybe learned the lesson that others before them had, and about the power of reading, the power of information. And that's a kind of just a powerful example of what reading can do. And there are all sorts of efforts. I write just about a couple in the book to censor material. And this is happening first and foremost in bookstores. There aren't libraries really at the time, not the kind of public libraries that we imagine. So the way that anyone is getting books for the first, 100 years or so of American history is through these booksellers who are deciding in many ways what people are going to see and have access to.
Do you have this memorized, Franklin's epitaph?
I don't have it memorized, but I know that I end the chapter with it. And I went and visited his gravestone in Philadelphia, and they have a cool little printing museum where there are interpreters who show you the very skilled process that went into printing back then, which was involved, and you had to print things in reverse and upside down, and it was all inky and messy. But on his grave, he writes that he was a printer, and he has this kind of analogy, says something to the effect of that He hopes his edition will be amended in the future or updated.
I
I've got
have
it
it
right.
here,
Yeah,
thanks
you got it,
to
Bob.
the interwebs. The body of B. Franklin, printer, like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here, food for worms. But the work shall not be wholly lost, for it will be, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more perfect edition, corrected and amended by the author.
Well, that's much more eloquent than I than I fumbled, but the basic gist is there. And he proudly carried his identity as a printer, a bookseller, and a reader and a writer throughout his whole life. And that's what he, thought of himself as. And those are the kind of identity politics to the degree that, obviously that phrase didn't exist back then, but that's how he understood where he was coming from. And as a revolutionary, his experience as a bookseller was paramount.
Until relatively recently, the bookshop, its existence and its purpose hinged upon scarcity. The idea that these products weren't readily available, whether you had something rare, as Franklin did with these pamphlets, and you had to go to a place, or you have the traveling salespeople who go places without bookshops, and or whether you get into, like, the Gotham store that is selling under the counter texts that are forbidden from people for having. And I wonder, even though we're talking about different eras, that transition from scarcity to very much the 21st century, this post-scarcity world we live in, to me, that, I guess maybe because of the way I see the world, that struck me as like the biggest real change. That once you get to post-scarcity, there's a whole different set of issues than there is before. What do you think about this concept?
Yeah, I think that's true. And there were many reasons to think that when books could easily be had elsewhere, that the bookstore as an institution would go kaput. And these weren't, I don't think, crazy people or necessarily overly panicked kind of individuals. But sure, we live in a world today where everybody knows they can get every book online with the click of a button at either the same price you're paying at the bookshop in East Nashville, or maybe even less, delivered to your door. So now it's a question of a kind of overabundance. Everybody is inundated with options. You go on Amazon or anywhere else, and it seems endless. And people are telling you what to read in from all different kinds of directions. So now the bookstore is sort of creating this very curated world. And in many ways, what people find attractive about them is that there are people there, and the bookshelves themselves are guiding you towards some maybe more manageable set of choices. So it's not kind of forced scarcity, I wouldn't call it, but there's a real appeal to walking into Three Lives and Company, which is 650 square feet. They have a lot of books, but you feel like you can walk around the store. You can go over to the history section, the cookbook section, memoirs, whatever, and get a pretty good feel. And perhaps most of all, you can talk to a human being, and that person can, as you did to begin this conversation, talk about why people are invested in a certain book and share that kind of passion and recommendation. So I think there's a kind of the scarcity is a problem economically on one hand, but it also that there's some attractiveness, or at least in our world, a desire to have a marketplace that's a little more manageable or navigable.
Yeah, maybe that's the concept. Maybe the post scarcity world of books and options for reading has produced itself a scarcity of spaces that are humane, and probably more the humane spaces might be more sparse today than books were 200 years ago. But yeah, okay, I like that, because this is the stuff I've been, like, my wheels have been grinding, and I'm like, well, what's the product? But yeah, it's a place I can always walk into the bookshop up the street and just go ask Joelle or whoever's working about what's a good book, and they're there, and it's cool. You have a conversation
And that feels that feels as human as anything that we do in our daily lives anymore. Walking into a physical store filled with physical books, talking to a real person, even if you don't know them well, and they are just telling you why you should read this book, is not just pleasant, but again, without wanting to sound hokey, almost a kind of magical thing that still exists that many of us enjoy. Yeah, and feels remarkably human.
We don't have time to go into every one of these bookstores and people you feature throughout this book. I just have to hit on this one. I want to get to another one, but first we have to name drop Ben Parson Weems.
Oh yeah, he
Because
makes an
whenever
appearance.
Parson Weems shows up somewhere, we need to at least mention Parson Weems.
He complains. The guy he works for complains too much.
Where is Parson Weems showing up in all the other books? That's what I'm curious about. He's a kind of
Oh,
secondary figure in
he's the
America.
cherry tree guy.
Yes,
He is
he's
the
the
and
originator of the myth. That's where he most
That's
often
right,
shows
that's
up.
right.
You got to
yeah.
give him credit. He did. Everybody wanted a Washington biography, and a lot of people were like, we got to gather information." He was kind of private, and Parson
Yeah.
Williams goes, "No, we don't. We could just make it up."
So
Yeah.
so tell us about Parson Weems as a bookseller.
Well, I write about him briefly in a chapter on itinerant booksellers, people who are traveling the country. This was a common way to sell books in the colonial period. And I think one of the really interesting things later on, when brick and mortar bookstores become much more common, is the continuance of people who are mobile booksellers. So he's a kind of very early example, and is an interesting character himself. Although I'm trying to think of other historical characters who are famous or infamous for just spreading lies or creating myths. That's what he's sort of best known for, is an interesting legacy to have. And I
A whole
write
nother episode, Evan.
I was gonna say, talk to us in 50 years. We might have a new episode on the history of that.
even more, I think, more interesting than Parson Weems are the people in the 20th century who are getting vans and sometimes horses and wagons before that, and parading around the neighborhood, the country, in some cases, selling books. And I write briefly in the book about a fictional book called Parnassus on Wheels, which I highly recommend, which is written by Christopher Morley, who's this bookstore connoisseur, and he shows up all over the place in the book because he's just friends with all these leading booksellers. And it's a great little novella, very short, easy to read, charming, about this couple who goes around and sells used books out of a horse and wagon. And it was such a remarkable book that it inspired a wave of people to actually do this. And I write about that. And I was just also interested in, like, what is a bookstore? And one of the easiest ways to answer those questions, or to kind of try and find the periphery or the boundaries or the bookstores that are a little odd or off. So I was really intrigued by non-traditional bookstores, and I wrote a section about bookstores on the sidewalk in the same kind of vein as these bookstores that just hit you in the face, that you're just walking down the street and boom, there's there, or somebody knocks on your door trying to sell you books, is of course a different kind of experience and a traditional, but I think also interesting.
Talk about Marshall Fields
Yeah.
and what made that and what made it so significant.
Yeah, 'cause
So this was a giant.
This is where I wanted to jump in here too, Bob.
Yeah.
Sorry, Evan, because I'm really excited about this. Because this is where I think there's a couple ways in your book that, like, these ideas, they kind of shake us, right? Like today, people are like, yeah, you walk into a bookstore and they're just selling candles and lotions and stuff, and you're like, that's what they were doing at first. And then we think of, like, corporate, these giant stores as being the antithesis of, like, the bookshop ethos. But yeah, I think this is why Bob was excited too. We both were smiling about this. It's not always so simple when you look at Marshall Fields.
Yeah,
and,
Marshall Field,
Honards.
which was the leading department store in the country. And this surprised me too, was maybe the one of the greatest bookstores in the country at the same time, and heralded as such even by the kind of people we would call indie booksellers today. And I grew up in the 80s and 90s in suburban Baltimore. And, as a kid, I liked to hang out in the mall. But department stores were not glamorous to me at all. They were, part of suburban America, and they were not luxurious. But earlier in the 19th century, later in the 19th century, and early in the 20th century, these became sort of palaces of consumption. And there are lots of examples in different American cities. And Marshall Field's was among the leading retailers in the country. And it was also super high end. And this amazing building that I write about in the book that had all these amenities and fancy restaurants and places to hang out and pneumatic tubing and elevators and tons of horses that were on call who, in some cases, would deliver books from the book department to people. So this woman who starts it, her name is Marcella Burns Honor, and she is there from the very beginning and creates a book section of a department store. But it's so gigantic and she's so gifted that it functions as an independent bookstore in many different ways, but it has the leverage and kind of backing of this corporate behemoth and the ability to spend all sorts of money. And she not only creates a beautiful space and has, serious readers on staff who are tremendously helpful, but she also innovates in a number of different ways and is really credited with bringing authors to bookstores, which may sound weird to us today, but publishers were worried that the authors might actually turn off readers when they meet these people in person. They sound great and they're a great writer, but they're a little awkward or they don't know how to give a talk or whatever else. So she created book fairs, she brought in authors, she made it a spectacle, and the space was beautiful and enormous. So she would order tons of copies of certain books and in some cases effectively create a market for certain kinds of books, certain authors, and everybody in publishing, authors, other booksellers wanted Marcella Burns Honor's kind of ear to learn from her. And I write about Frances Steloff at the Gotham Book Mart, which is a very different kind of bookstore, are probably the two most important booksellers over the course of 60 years in American history. And they're both women who are not famous. And that was a kind of surprising detail.
A tidbit that I really enjoyed was that Honors creates the first book fair after going to see an auto fair. And she goes, "We could do this for books." And you're like, "What?" And that's like 1919. So we're not too far out from 100 years of that happening.
Yeah. And again, people thought that she was crazy for doing that because she was trying to bring in different publishers to cooperate. And she wanted to us, most people going into a bookstore are kind of publisher agnostic. They look at the book, the subject matter, the title, the author. But, the Bookshop is published by Viking. That doesn't mean a ton to most readers. But back then it meant a lot more. And there were people who thought of Doubleday and Knopf as these kind of brands, and they had real reputations at stake, and they were always fighting with one another in a variety of ways. So the idea that they would kind of be willing to sit at a table or have one author from this publisher sit next to another author at another publisher seemed to some people absurd, but it worked, and it worked fantastically. And these are events that are still vibrant. As an author, they're my favorite places to go. It's like I was at the National Book Festival. I went to the Miami Book Fair, all these places promoting this book. And it's like going to a baseball game, but instead of everybody wearing Orioles jerseys, they have, T-shirts with reading slogans, and they have tote bags from bookshops. And it's, you're walking around the concourse and there's just a frenzy of book loving people. And it's really among the most uplifting spaces for anybody invested in reading and writing today. Is go to your state or city's book festival or fair. They're a lot of fun.
So, traveling around like I do, I go to a lot of bookstores. And in the earliest days of our band, when it was four of us, like we would play in these rock clubs, punk clubs, and you wouldn't need to show up until 8 p.m. So we would get into the town and we would go to Barnes and Noble. And it was a place that we could all disperse. Like you're driving in a van for 8 hours. So you want to get away from everybody you're with. So we would go to a Barnes and Noble and sit there and be there for like 3 or 4 hours and disperse, get a cup of coffee, look at books, come, purchase things, and then come together at the end of that time and leave and share our treasures with each other. So bookstores, they are, like we've been talking about, part of the landscape. So, but the more we traveled, there were certain bookstores in the country that we would meet people and they were like a historic site or a place you had to go to, like a restaurant. Two of those places, the Strand in New York City. You go to New York City, someone goes, you got to go to the Strand. Powell's in Portland, Oregon. You go to Portland, Oregon, people would say, you got to go to Powell's. Talk about those two bookstores because they show up in your book.
Yeah, they're the two most famous independent bookstores in the country today. And they both have long and rich histories. And I think there are some booksellers who work at very small stores that have no national or international reputation. And I have talked to some who I wouldn't say hold a grudge or are jealous, but have some kind of feeling of angst toward these stores, which they see as closer to Barnes and Noble than they are to them in terms of how they operate, right? Because they're giant in every way, not just the physical scope of the stores, but their marketing plans and the number of employees and et cetera. But I think most people, myself included, delight in the fact that a bookstore can be a tourist destination. And there are people even today, you said this, that these have been sites, they remain so. People, if you're a Swedish tourist coming to New York City, you're likely to want to see the Empire State Building, the High Line, and the Strand. It's still on the list. And I think that's wonderful. They both have this kind of brand recognition that is very helpful to them. The Strand is a third generation family business. The Powell's is also a family business, actually started in Chicago and then moved to Portland. And in both cases, started from very small enterprises and gradually built themselves up into these mega stores. And part of their appeal is the scale, that they're these gigantic palaces to literature, and you can spend days sort of wandering the aisles of each. I interviewed the current owner of the Strand and did an event there and had a lot of fun. And I write very briefly about how during the pandemic, Powell's bottled a perfume that was supposed to smell like bookstore as a way for people who couldn't come inside during the COVID-19 closures, as a kind of a funny but also very real allure of the bookstore, which is its smell. So there's still some on eBay if any listeners are really desperate to smell Powell's, super fans.
I'm kind of interested myself just to smell it.
You might
I'm
be able to
interested
find...
but I also think that like as soon as I smell it, I'll be like, ugh.
Yeah. Hey, so was it the Strand that you had to take a test to work there or like prove your bona fides to work there?
Yes. So there was this literary test where you were supposed to match the author with the title of the book. And like all great, I don't know, such such mythic exams, there was a twist or some kind of trick, which is that essentially there was one that wasn't matched at all, and you were supposed to know that. And I write about this guy whose name was Bert Britton, who's one of the most fascinating people, who became this literary figure who was very good friends with Norman Mailer, Saul Bellow, all these writers, by virtue of working in the basement at the Strand. And he self-declared himself the greatest reader in the world. And for some reason, all these literary people seemed to believe him. And he had this party that I write about at the Strand. Kurt Vonnegut was there, and it was just kind of legendary. So he was famous for having aced this quiz and being the kind of like bookish face of the Strand for a number of years before he left to start his own bookshop, which failed miserably, supposedly because of his ego.
He had, but didn't a very wealthy person poach him, kind of?
Yeah, so it was Jeanette Watson, who was a descendant of the IBM Watson, who she and him opened up a bookshop on the Upper East Side together, and they had a quick falling out. And he left and unfortunately died because I really wish he was somebody, one of many historical characters that I wish I could have met. He was among the most alluring and interesting.
It seems like the problem with that is built in, because if you proclaim to be the greatest reader of all time and you get a really good customer who's buying a lot of books, like instead of seeing a good customer, you just see a competitor. Like, oh, this guy's reading a lot of books, huh? Time to cut him off.
Yeah, well, he also I mean, in ways that may not have resonated well today, he liked to be like he criticized people all the time, how they pronounced authors' names. And there would be famous authors who would come in, people who would make us tremble. And they would say, "Oh, this is what I'm reading," and he would say, "That's garbage," and hand them something else. So part of his appeal was that he didn't seem to have any filter.
It's-
You know,
I know that guy though, going to the record stores or music stores as a young man, a teenager. There was always that guy. There was
yeah,
always that guy. He was listening to he knew what the best thing coming out was, or the best music was, and what you bought was crap.
yeah. But he managed to win over a huge, slice of sort of literate society. But in the end, it didn't work out for him. So he had a downfall, and
got-
which is kind of sad. But he was this. It's also interesting that you could be a kind of cultural icon by being a bookseller. So this is in the 70s. So he would show up in all these kind of, the versions of what TMZ is today or something like that, gossip pages and newspapers. And he married this model who was famous, and it was all over the news, and people, he was the it couple. He and Kirby, I think her name was, he was a real celebrity. And he worked in the basement of the Strand, making very close to minimum wage.
As a guy who's one of his favorite authors is Ron Chernow, and spent many, I bet there's 50 episodes of the show where I said Chernow, and I only found that out when I narrated the review of Ron Chernow's Twain biography and got notes back from the Atlantic saying, great read, but you just said his name wrong. I'm sympathetic to people who say people's names wrong, because sometimes you love them, you just didn't know.
Yes.
So when you had this idea for this book and you began to talk about, first of all, I'll give you two questions. Have there been any other books like this? Like, have there been any other histories of bookstores that you came across in your research? And talk about doing the research. Did you go, like, how much traveling did you do? How many bookstores did you visit? How did you piece this together?
Yeah. So there have been
It's like six questions.
No. As a writer, my biggest fear is always being scooped. Like there's this, how much how forthcoming am I that I'm working on this project? In some ways, it's helpful to put a flag somewhere, because then people have information or sources that they might share with you, or people may be scared off of writing it. But on the other hand, I'm worried somebody's always going to steal the idea. And I was shocked that there wasn't a real popular history of the bookstore as an institution when I started this. Now, there are lots of scholarly volumes about different aspects of book selling, and the history of the book is a fairly fertile field in history. But a lot of it is about the book itself as an object and the kind of rise of the printing press and the ways in which the codex and all these different forms of books come to be. And there's much less literature and seemingly fewer books about the ways in which books are circulated in more modern times. So there wasn't really an equivalent book to this, which worked in my favor. And I think there could be lots of other different versions of it. And I just got lucky in that respect. To do the research, it's a huge topic. And I can't even exactly remember what I said in my proposal I was going to include, but I know a lot of stuff changed by virtue of the kind of sources that I found, the stories that I wanted to tell, the stories that I thought were great to tell, but I just couldn't reliably do so because I didn't have the evidence. And I visited as many bookstores as I could, archives and libraries around the country, and would often double dip. So I was doing research in Chicago about the history of Marshall Fields. And then when the archive closed, I would spend all my remaining time visiting the extant, bookstores and talking to booksellers, and did that in city after city. And at one point I had a list of ones that I visited, and I stopped keeping it. So I don't remember the number, but it's a huge amount. And I wanted to try and sprinkle in, anecdotes about today and the past and kind of jump back and forth. But I will say that the criticism I get most often, and one which I was very prepared for, is that I didn't include enough bookshops. And people will write to me some version of the same letter, which is, "Dear Evan, I love your book. It's great. You're such a good writer, but how could you not include fill in the blank bookstore? I grew up at fill in the blank bookstore. This fill in the blank bookstore has been a neighborhood institution for 30 years, et cetera, et cetera." And I read those and I agree with the people. I feel very, it's not that I'm defensive about it. Usually I'm like, yeah, I'm sure there are lots of good stories to tell there, and maybe I should have included it. But we are, of course, bound by page counts, word count, deadlines. There's only so many stories that can fit in a reasonably sized book.
What is one that you did not include? Is there one that you were like, you wrote it and you were just didn't make the final cut?
Um, I had, I had a whole chapter originally on college bookstores. So I'm a university professor, and I'm intrigued by the notion that a college bookstore was once the intellectual hub of campus, which I understand that they were. And as a professor now, the word, when I see it says JMU bookstore, this is not about JMU. JMU, great institution, great employer, by the way. But the bookstore should probably have quotes around the word bookstore because
Yeah,
it's a hoodie store.
I was about to say that.
it
And it's
is.
not just JMU or NYU or these other ones, it's everywhere. So I had gone up to Harvard and done a bunch of research there about their legendary bookstore and found all these great catalogs and brochures from like the 1940s where it was like, how are you a Harvard man? And it was, you needed the right tweed coat and pipe and whatever. But it was also, you had to have this edition of Shakespeare on your shelf. It was part of a larger education. I had written about, and then there are other bookstores I've been to. There's Warwick's, which is in San Diego. This great indie bookstore has been there forever. And I went in, and the people there were very nice. I signed a bunch of copies, and one of the women was like, you really could have included us in the book. And it's like, I almost did, and I can't remember why. I don't know what happened. It was like a couple sentences. So there are a lot of cases like that of great bookstore. There's Square Books is very, very famous, is legendary in Oxford, Mississippi. I know about it. Everybody's told me about it. I've done research about it, and it just didn't show up in the book. And I kind of wish that it did. And I don't really have a good explanation for why it just didn't fit or materialize. And it wasn't that I didn't know about it, but Yeah.
But could I interject here as a reader who honestly was surprised when I got to the end because uh, Jeff Kinney's bookstore, An Unlikely Story, right? I think Freakonomics did a whole multi-part series on it. It's so fascinating. And I thought, surely he's going to write about Jeff Kinney's book because Jeff Kinney, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, we
Yeah.
have every single one of those. My son has read every one of those books probably 4 times. And then there's this bookstore where he's created. It doesn't make any sense financially. He pays the workers incredibly well, brings in these authors to this small town. And I was like, it just seems like the interest would be there. But I think the case could be made here that like, yes, but that fulfills the role. You're telling an arc. You're telling a story here. Really, if you think about that, it fills the role that Parnassus fills in the narrative. And you've got to narrow it down. And what you're telling is the story of this just greater trajectory of how book spaces evolve. And, sure, the Kinney store is in itself fascinating, but it is the same thing. Famous author comes into a place to fill a gap, treats people incredibly well, invests themselves in it. And this tells us something about this moment in bookstore history. I don't know, like, aside from the interesting specifics, that it would have added. Because when you think about it and where Parnassus fits in your narrative, it would have kind of felt like, okay, you've made this point here with this bookshop, and it is not to undermine the brilliance of this institution. It's simply to say that when we write, we have an economy of words. We're trying to tell a narrative, and I think you did that effectively.
Well, I appreciate that. And I should have included it. I can't remember if it was name dropped or not.
It
I
was.
have
You
a
listed
couple.
it in there one time. I
Yeah,
went back
okay.
and searched after I read the book to make
Right.
sure I didn't miss something.
Because I have this, and um, I appreciate your reading there because the idea was to sort of have big themes told through smaller stories. So Parnassus is the framing of a chapter, but it's about much more than that. And I do write about this trend of successful people, authors included, namely, who see the bookstore as an endangered institution and are rescuing it as they might other kinds of cultural kind of institutions. And yeah, you mentioned one. There's, Lin-Manuel Miranda bought the Drama Bookshop in New York City, where he just hung out as a kid and was a special place to him. And I don't think he thinks of it as a profit center, but he's devoted to this institution and wants to make sure it survives and has the resources to do so.
Is the bookstore endangered? I mean, you talk about the threats, you talk about the rise of Barnes and Noble, and I'd like to get into a little history about Barnes and Noble, in a minute, and Borders, and then Amazon.
Amazon. We got to talk about Amazon.
Where are we today in publishing and bookselling?
There's a couple of different through lines and threads and narratives and ways of thinking about it. On the one hand, it's very clear that there are far fewer bookstores today per capita than there have been for much of the history of the United States, especially in various so-called golden ages. So there are relatively few bookstores, and there are media reports and good reason to celebrate the fact that the great decline in the number of bookstores seems to have leveled off. And in recent years, there have even been a modest increase in number. But the increase is still relatively modest, and we're nowhere near the number that there were back before Borders and Barnes and Noble became popular. And it's hard to imagine that we will ever get to that. So they are endangered. And the people who are supporting them, as I mentioned earlier, are doing so very consciously aware, right? That they're with their pocket book, their wallet, trying to keep these institutions alive. On the other hand, I think it's also remarkable how many bookstores there are. So there are far fewer than there used to be, but that the institution is still alive to the degree that it is in many ways remarkable. There's so many good reasons. The rise of ebooks and then audiobooks, the rise of Amazon, the big corporate players that came in first, B. Dalton and Walden Books, and then more recently Borders and Barnes and Noble. How could the little independent bookstore compete? In many ways, they couldn't, and a lot of them shuttered. But many of them did and survived and are still around for us to celebrate. So it's a very precarious business. There are so many headwinds and challenges, and I think it's a kind of yeah, it's on the one hand comforting to know how many we have, while we should all still appreciate that they are precarious institutions and they can very well disappear if we decide that they're not worth saving.
I love you point this out towards the end that the story of the the resurgence slash scarcity or like resurgence slash threat to bookstores. You say either way you take it, it actually serves the bookstores actually, because if you believe in there's a resurgence, you're more likely to start one. But if you believe that they're endangered, you're more likely to go out of your way to support them. I thought that was a very positive way of looking at it.
Yeah, and it's a tricky thing. And as somebody who wants bookstores to survive, I'm get this question all the time, and there are people. It's a hard thing when sort of industry promoters are rah celebrating. I don't want to be the one to throw cold water and be like, actually, yeah, 40 more bookstores open this year, but we're still thousands away from what there used to be. So, and like anything else, there's ways of, manipulating numbers to make them seem worse or better. And this is a subject that people are interested in. So people on both sides who are sort of calling for the resurgence or giving the kind of final outcome that bookstores are dead can find evidence to support their claim. And people like reading in the New York Times articles about the success or lack thereof of bookstores because it is this special kind of institution.
A couple interesting things you noted about Barnes and Noble. You said that chains, actually, bookstore chains, go back to the 20s. You say that Muzak, Muzak, I don't know if people know what that is anymore, but it was canned, best described by me, or described by me, as described by me. I don't know about best, but it was canned music. We would think of it almost as elevator music, but just canned music that plays in stores. You say that that started at a Barnes and Noble. You say that at one point, at the height of their dominance, Barnes and Noble had had input into the covers of books by well-known writers. So give us the 5-minute story of Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. It started out as, one group for another, and there's a whole long sort of familial history of how it becomes
By
Barnes.
the way, before you get into this,
Yes.
I'll add one more thing. Barnes and Noble almost bought Amazon. Go ahead.
Yes. So Barnes and Noble, as we know it, was really birthed in the 1980s by this guy named Len Riggio, who was an NYU student, worked at the bookstore, was from an Italian American working class neighborhood in Brooklyn called Bensonhurst. And he would go into bookstores in Manhattan, and they were, to him, not the kinds of places that his buddies growing up in Bensonhurst would go to. And he wasn't the first one to think of bookstores as having sometimes a kind of elitist or stuffy atmosphere. So he had this idea to create a kind of bookstore for the every person in a way, and for middle America in some ways. So he buys Barnes and Noble, which at the time is a regional player that really is invested in college textbooks mostly. And it's not like he has any money. He borrows it, and he's a really charismatic guy who I was fortunate enough to interview for the book. And he ends up just building Barnes and Noble as we know it into this powerhouse that was more influential than I think we could imagine. So the publishers would literally pay Barnes and Noble to have their books placed in the store. The end caps, big table displays. They called it co-op advertising. And so they were dependent on Barnes and Noble, and to some degree Borders, on the success of a book, and were paying them directly. And the publishers tried to woo the Barnes and Noble buyers to any degree that they could, so much so that Barnes and Noble, for big books coming out, would have a seat at the table. So when a book like my book, um, 6 months, 8 months before publication, they start working on the cover, getting blurbs, other kinds of things. And those meetings are usually between the graphic designer who comes up with some material, the editor of the book, the author, and the author's agent. But back then, it was very common for Barnes and Noble to also be at that meeting and say, well, if you want us to put this out on the table, you got to give us a better cover. We don't like it. Or we don't like the title. Or you should get blurbs from better authors. And so it's this fascinating story. And I grew up, Barnes and Noble was my local bookstore in Columbia, Maryland, a suburb of Baltimore. So I knew this institution well. I've seen You've Got Mail, tons of times. And it was a real honor to interview Len Riggio, which turned out to be toward the end of his life. He recently passed away. And he became a billionaire through Barnes and Noble, but he also started GameStop and all these other things. And um, he famously didn't want to do a lot of interviews because he was seen as a villain, the person who killed the mom and pop bookstore. And he only granted me an interview by by mistake, I think. A friend of a friend of a friend vouched for me or something, I don't know. And I walk in and he says, "How's Peter doing?" And I have no idea who Peter is to this day. I'm just like, great. And led he was, I think in his 80s at the time, but he was so energetic and charismatic. It wasn't hard to imagine how this person built such a successful business, even from just spending an hour with him. And he's showing me he's an art collector at this time and a philanthropist. He's showing me all around his office. At one point, he touches one of these paintings, which makes me kind of cringe in a way. But okay, it's his painting. He could do what he wants with it. And then we sit down and talk. And he just at some point casually mentions Amazon and how he thought Jeff Bezos was genius, what they were doing was genius. He was very worried it was going to ruin Barnes and Noble's business. So he flies out to Seattle and takes Jeff Bezos out to dinner. And they're chomping on steak. And he says, "Yeah, so I made an offer for Amazon right there over dinner." And Bezos declined it. And Riggio, in some humility, said that that was the best thing Jeff Bezos ever did because he would have screwed up Amazon and didn't know anything about e-commerce and the whole Amazon Kindle versus Barnes and Noble's, Nook showed some of Barnes and Noble's inability to move beyond brick and mortar bookselling and their kind of failed attempts. So it was just a kind of interesting space to be in and was a lot of fun to talk to him. And in his own telling, to think about really the power and the good that Barnes and Noble did do. So we mentioned earlier, bookstores are very much urban institutions. People in the suburbs, this is before Amazon, there weren't many bookstores, and all sorts of censuses and directories show that a lot of Americans lived in bookstore deserts. And it really wasn't until Barnes and Noble that the bookstore became a suburban institution as much as an urban institution.
Well, I said we've got to talk about Amazon, but we're running out of time, and maybe that's where we leave it for the people to pick up the book, because I think the role, it fits within this greater shift. You go from the early days of Marshall Fields, where the booksellers refuse to sell to anyone who discounts their books, to a time where the publishers themselves become dependent upon the mass booksellers who do discount their books. And there is a huge change in there. Bob, if you don't have any more questions, because this is the thing where I get to the point where I go, we need to wrap up. I've either got 5 more questions, 10 more questions, or...
Well, I will be merciful for Evan here. He's been a great guest. And, we talked about earlier, you talked about how when you write a book, you try to get people to, you don't want people to know what you're working on because you don't want to get scooped. And I don't think anybody else could have written this book but you, because there's a lot of heart and soul in it, and it's definitely it is as pleasurable to read as it is to sit in a bookstore. So congratulations,
Well,
great work. Can't wait to see what you put out next. And when you do, you have a place here if you want to come talk about it.
well, I don't know if that's true, but it's very kind of you to say. And so I will gladly take it. Thank you very much.
Before we go, Evan, where can people find you? Is there anywhere people can keep up with what you're writing, or follow your public statements of thought?
I have a very anemic Instagram account, which is just my name, Evan Friss. I have a website, evanfriss.com, and I don't output a lot of material. I am working on another book, and I just put all my focus into writing so much, and I probably should do a better job of trying to connect with people along the way, but it's never been my forte.
I'll take you keep writing books there, Evan. I'll take that one. Links to all that will be in the episode description. Again, Evan Friss's book is The Bookshop, A History of the American Bookstore. Evan, thanks so much for the great book and for your time.
The pleasure was all mine. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Road to Now. If you enjoyed this episode, please tell the world by giving us 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts or 5 stars on Spotify. Or spread the word directly. Just text a friend maybe, or share a link on social media. Anything helps and we appreciate it. And if you've got a friend who hasn't gotten into podcasts yet, let them know they can hear us every weekend on SiriusXM's POTUS channel 124. Now is the time when we say our special thanks to our supporters on Patreon and give a shout out to our Washingtonians. That list is Tanya Marsh, Mary Hawking, Tim and Caitlin Wells, Fig White, Matt Williams, Team Martin, Ann Williams and Frank Edwards, Nate Farrer, Jennifer and Magnolia, Chris and Teresa Adams, Joy Avery, Edward Carlson, and Aaron and Derek Garrison. Thanks to all you guys for supporting us. If you want to support our work and maybe get on that list, you can join us on Patreon at patreon.com/theroadtonow. You'll get extended versions of select conversations, extra episodes, bonus materials, and more. That's all available at patreon.com/theroadtonow. For more on the show, visit our website, theroadtonow.com, where you can easily search our back catalog and quickly find links to content. Why is it so good? 7 Ages Design. That's who made it. If you're looking for a website, go check them out. The Road to Now is hosted and produced by Bob Crawford and me, Ben Sawyer. Our associate producer is Gary Fletcher. This episode was edited by Ben Sawyer, and our theme music, like pretty much always, was by Paul DeFiglia. For Bob Crawford, this is Ben Sawyer. Thank you for listening. Take care.